Ladies and gentlemen, you are wonderful to be here tonight. We always like to observe that you could be anywhere, but you chose to be here, and we are much honored to have you with us. This is the launch of the 41st History Alive lecture series, and we could think of no better person to launch us into the next 50 years of life than Dr. John Warren. This series is always on the first Thursday of the month, September through June. Please come back and see us. It's always free. It's always essential. It's always a big surprise. All kinds of wonderful people have shared their expertise and their technical knowledge on a huge variety of topics. For example, we're going to have back Dr. Pat Abbott, and you've seen him on television many times, and he will tell you when the big one hits, will you be ready? That's earthquakes, of course. So the last time he told us about this, none of us were ready, and we have since changed things in our homes, as I know you will too when you hear him. So without any further ado, let's get on with the main event here. We are very thrilled to have Dr. John Warren with us. Dr. Warren, you were born in North Carolina.
Yes.
And your parents did not let you go to the local schools. More about that anon. You are a horseman. You love horses.
Yes.
You are a lawyer. JD from Howard.
Yes.
And associated degrees from other institutions. You are an ordained minister, and you led the charge in Congress with Adam, well, as the key congressional aide to Adam Clayton Powell, trailblazer Shirley Chisholm. I'm leaving somebody out.
Gus Hawkins of California.
Gus Hawkins of California, how could I? And most notably, in our corner of paradise, you have been a journalist, a writer of great note, television and radio and print. You all have the most recent edition of San Diego Voice and Viewpoint, which Dr. Warren has published for a quarter of a century.
At least.
At least. Yeah. Because the paper is coming up on its 60th year.
59th.
59th.
Yes.
As one of the most distinguished weekly newspapers in the country. You'll find in this newspaper people and events that you just don't read about elsewhere. I encourage you to go to those wretched little boxes that always take your quarter, and then you have to kick them. But even better, go online, SanDiegoVoiceAndViewpoint.com, and subscribe. Hello. My dear, can you come round this way and go all the way over there, and you'll find chairs? Oh, we know everyone here. Okay, it's a royal progress. Sure, just somewhere over there. Hello. Come this way. We get to know each other very quickly in this building because this is a medieval Tudor revival. And in a room like this in the 15th century, it was you, your kids, a pig, and a cow, in all likelihood. So life was a little more rugged than it is now. We are going to start off this evening with a little bit of talk about the Constitution. What could be more timely in light of what's happening in the country right now? And I can think of no better person to give us a warm view of that. Should we start with the First Amendment, or you start with?
I can.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm suggesting the First Amendment because it cuts right across the entire Constitution.
Great. Thank you. I wish I had the funds to hire Helen as my personal PR person. I might even get a nomination to the Supreme Court. Because you really don't have to be a lawyer to be a member of the court, but most people don't know that. Okay. But how many people here, let me ask, have been following the hearings on Judge Kavanaugh? Okay, so you probably have a lot of questions. And I've tried to structure this in such a way that I talk a little bit about the Constitution and have time for interaction in terms of your questions, because there's so many things involved in it. I've had the honor, I guess, of having grown up in Washington, D.C. I went to school there. I was born in North Carolina, but my mother did not want me to go to school in North Carolina because of the segregated school system. And so I went to school in Washington. And in Washington, D.C., prior to the 1954 desegregation of the schools, Brown versus Board of Education, we had institutions, African-American institutions, that had people teaching at the college level. And they were teaching at the college level. They had PhDs because of the glass ceiling that did not allow them to teach at universities. And so in Washington, there was the post office, and the post office department was known as the official plantation because there were so many black people there with advanced degrees and talents who could not work elsewhere. And that whole culture was the basis of E. Franklin Frazier's, the noted sociologist's book, The Black Bourgeoisie, which is a very interesting insight into black culture. But today, I feel very fortunate to be here to talk to you a little bit. I grew up in Washington. I had the pleasure of being able to go to the Supreme Court often and just sit in on arguments. Same in the court system there, long before I ever thought about becoming a lawyer. Really never had any plans to be a lawyer. I thought that lawyers and journalists were very smart people. I know better now. And, and so I had hesitation about being either. But I did have an opportunity to be a part of living history in terms of the Constitution, because I went to work on Capitol Hill at the age of 17 for a summer. And because when they hired me and I just finished high school, I took shorthand at about 80 words a minute and I typed at about 70. I did get my shorthand up to 120, so I could take the news down. And when I did go to school at night, I would take notes, and at the end of the semester, I would sell copies of my notes to both the professor and my classmates. Because my notes were more accurate than the professor's notes, since I got every word they added in addition to their study outline. And so I was there when Adam Clayton Powell was expelled from the House of Representatives, and when an attorney by the name of Herbert O. Reed took his case, and history will show that he did prevail and he was able to regain his seat. I worked for the Committee on Education and Labor for a number of years, so I was there when, some of you will appreciate this, when Age Discrimination in Employment was created. I was there when the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission was created. I was there for the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, was in the room with people like Dr. King and the Big Six. I was there when they planned the March on Washington for 1963. Like Zechariah in the Bible, I was on the mall. I climbed a tree so I could get a good view. So I was there for the march. But to get back to the Constitution in terms of time, it's very interesting to see where we are today and to look back. And I've concluded that today, there are not a lot of us spending time looking at the document or what the framers intended or how. And so we get a lot of myth and fragmentation in terms of information. I had the good fortune of being trained as a political scientist. and it was something that I was very much involved with in terms of history. At one point, I was a vice president of a public policy institute that was comparable to the Heritage or the Urban Institute. And I provided staff to members of the U.S. Conference of Mayors and the National League of Cities. Those organizations had policy committees that designed the programs that they wanted to see go through Congress. And I was there to staff them in the areas of labor, though I have a dual background, both in terms of education and labor. I acquired a background in both of those areas legislatively many years before I ever thought about becoming a lawyer. But after working with lawyers for so long and realizing they weren't as smart as I thought they were, then I decided to try and join that little group. And so it's been very interesting seeing the changes that have come and seeing how people are interpreting history and looking at the difference in terms of the attitude today. In the days when I was there in the 89th Congress, when Adam Clayton Powell was chairman of the Education and Labor Committee, and he was tapped by President Johnson to carry the ball for the Great Society. So all of the programs that we got under the Great Society, from legal services to Job Corps, youth employment. I was there when we went from manpower development training to CETA, the Comprehensive Employment Training Act, to public service employment, where we had jobs for teachers and firefighters. Municipal budgets were being supplemented because of the economy. When we had a full employment bill passed in theory called the Humphrey-Hawkins Bill, named after Senator Hubert Humphrey and Congressman Hawkins. And their idea was that in America, unemployment should have a baseline, and that baseline was set like at 4%. And if we could keep unemployment that low and we could do these job training programs, then we could really help lift people up by their bootstraps. And so history will tell us to the extent that we were successful, because what's different today than 50 years ago is a sense of a moral consciousness on the part of America. But getting back to the Constitution, let me start with Article 1. And I'm going to very brief, I'm not going through all of them. As you know, there are 7 articles to the Constitution. The first 3 are perhaps the most important. Article 1 deals with the legislature in terms of giving the authority to Congress to legislate and to pass laws. Article 2 deals with the executive branch, being the president and the authority that he has as president. And so under Article 2, with the president being the chief, if you will, administrative officer for the federal government, the cabinet has been created and the layers have been added to the cabinet in terms of the number of positions that are there. Article 3 of the Constitution deals with the judiciary in terms of our court system. And Article 3 has a very rich history in terms of not only people who have served on the court, but what has happened with the lower courts and how judges are selected and confirmed. We know that judges, for the most part, when they come into the federal system, and there's some 700 today, that they are elected or appointed to their positions for life. And so the only way they can be moved is through impeachment. So the impeachment provisions in the Constitution under Article 2, there's a reference under Article 2, Section 4, I believe. The impeachment provisions are for officials, not just thinking of the president. Today, we are thinking about the president when we talk about impeachment, but impeachment is not restricted to them. We've had a couple of federal judges impeached. One of them I remember was a judge out of Nevada, I believe, and he was impeached because of his involvement, I believe, with the criminal element. Another one was a very famous African-American judge who, after impeachment and removal from office, went on to get elected to Congress, Alcee Hastings from Florida, and a very distinguished jurist in terms of what he was doing. And so the impeachment element is important. But let me just say something about the Constitution. After the 7 articles we have, then we get to what we put most emphasis on, the Bill of Rights. And under the Bill of Rights, we have the First Amendment, which talks about, and we refer to it as the Establishment Clause. And the First Amendment guarantees the freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and it also guarantees that the government shall make no religion. There shall be no established national religion. And that provision came about as a result of people's remembrance of what happened in England, where, as you know, the Church of England was created. And in the 1600s, there were laws in England that made it mandatory for people to go to church and to participate. We know the Church of England was created when the king wanted to divorce his wife, and he wasn't given permission by the Pope, and so he broke away, created his own church, established the Archbishop of Canterbury, and so we have the Anglican Church, and many people came over that were a part of that. And so historically, when the Founding Fathers began to do the Constitution, and they did it in 100 days in terms of drafting the document, it wasn't just enough that they drafted the document, it was also necessary to sell the document to the people of the 13 states, if you will, at the time. At the adoption by the Congress, the Continental Congress of the Constitution, there's a requirement for 9 states to ratify the document. And so what happened was James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and Alexander Hamilton wrote what we refer to today as the Federalist Papers. And the Federalist Papers are a series of 85 essays that in effect were written to sell the idea of the Constitution to the American people. And Hamilton has gotten a lot of publicity lately because of the play and Broadway, and people are getting excited. Our first treasurer, but Hamilton wrote some major pieces that have been discussed in the past 3 days in the Senate Judiciary Committee as Kavanaugh has been going through this interrogation leading up to the vote that's going to take place. And so these papers are very important. You can pull them up on the internet. You can Google the Federalists, and they go like from 1 to 85. If you make note, there are certain papers that you'd probably want to give more attention to. Federalist Paper number 10, Federalist Papers number 37, number 39, number 47, number 51, number 69, and number 78. And so those Federalist Papers that I just mentioned will give a great deal of insight into what was going on in terms of discussion. Now I want to touch on something real brief. I'm trying to cover a lot of stuff here. I want to get back to the First Amendment, because we've gone through this whole thing about separation of church and state. And I want to tell you that there's no such thing in the Constitution. Does not appear anywhere. The way we got there was in January of 1801, Thomas Jefferson had become president. Many people considered Jefferson an atheist, and they were very concerned about where he was going to come down in terms of his presidency. And they still had fragments in their minds of what I've said about what happened in England and having a church. And so in 1800, the Danbury Baptist Association wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson expressing their concern in terms of what was going to be the policy of his administration toward churches. And so the Baptists were different. There was also a group called the Congregationists, and you can Google this, the myth of separation of church and state. And what Jefferson did was he wrote a letter back to the Danbury Baptist Association, and he used some words that had come out of the mouth of one of the leading officials of the Baptist denomination at the time. And so what Jefferson said in this letter was that in my administration, we shall at no time have any problems in terms of church and state. And we shall maintain a wall of separation between the church and state. So that's where we first get that term, a wall of separation. It was not in the Constitution. It was what was placed in a letter. Now, here's the significance of this, and this has come out in the past 3 days of discussion, that when we talk about the Constitution and we talk about our laws, our lawmaking takes place in 3 components. And I might be a little rusty on this because it's been about 35 years since I graduated from law school, and I haven't clerked in at least 33. So I've tried to keep up from a journalist standpoint. But when we look at this situation with how our laws are made, we have common law, which is a carryover from the way things were done in England. And so we didn't have a body of laws, so we had things that happened. For instance, in English law, there was a case that came up many years before we got started about a man who sold a horse to a neighbor, and the horse that he sold was a mare, and the mare was pregnant. And so after the mare delivered the foal, the question came up, did the man buy 1 horse or 2 horses? Okay. And so common law then established a precedent that, okay, when you bought one, you got both. You can't take the mother and then come back and charge separately after birth. Okay. That kind of thinking in terms of common law ironically carried over in our own legal system, because in our criminal law, we've had the issue now well argued and debated as to when is the fetus a life? Okay, is it a life with a heartbeat, or is it a life when it takes the first breath? And so we got all of this discussion. Hence, we have Roe v. Wade and all that. Would you won't even go near any of that? Okay, so common law. Then we have statutory law, which goes back to Article 1 of the Constitution, where Congress legislates. So Congress has to pass laws. The beauty of the system is that the forefathers did not want to create kings or monarchs, and so they came up with a check and balance system. And the check and balance system works this way. Congress can pass the laws, and the president can administer the laws, but the president cannot make laws. All right? And so Congress can pass laws, but the Congress cannot make laws. You see that? So we have a situation then, and it's laid out in the Constitution, what age you have to be: 25 to get elected to the House, 35 to the Senate, 39 to be president. But you get a situation where when both houses act, they send legislation to the president. If he doesn't sign it and he vetoes it, a word we're familiar with, then it comes back to the originating body. 2/3 in each house can override what he did, and if 2/3 vote in support of the legislation, even though he vetoed it, then it becomes law. Well, when the law comes back, when the bill that's vetoed comes back to the Congress, it now goes before what they call a conference committee. And the conference committee of both houses have to come to an agreement on the language, and then when they pass that, that's the language that becomes law. So that's the second way that laws are made. The third way that laws are made are important to us because this way, and we've heard Kavanaugh and them talk about what's settled law. We've heard terms like stare decisis and how. The laws are made by the decisions that the Supreme Court makes. And so what happens is that if there's a question of something happening in terms of where Congress has come down, I'll give you an example. A famous case involved burning of the American flag during the Vietnamese War. And so we have a gut feeling about, no, we don't want to see the flag burn. And so this ended up going to court because some people wanted to lock up the people who were burning the flag. The courts had to decide whether or not the burning of the American flag is a freedom of expression protected under the First Amendment. They came down on the position that, yes, it is protected. And so even though we don't like it, it's protected. So then what happens is, if it's protected based on the court's interpretation, now it becomes a job of the Congress to go back and make a law that says burning of the flag is now a federal offense and not permitted. When Congress does that and the president signs it, then that overrides the decision that the court made at first. So what we've had now in the past 3 days is we've had a lot of discussion and a lot of concerns. Let me say, I've listened to Judge Kavanaugh, And I think that he's probably one of the most brilliant jurists I've ever come in contact with. And that's saying a lot, because when I was a law student at Howard, Justice Marshall used to come back to our law school, which he graduated from, and we would sit like in this room, and he would sit in a chair like this, and we sit around on the floor at his feet, and we would hold conversations with him. And that was a profound experience to be able to do that with that kind of, but there was one caveat. We always told people, do not ask him any stupid questions. Okay? And there would always be somebody new that would sit right there and try to sound important and ask the question. And he would look at them and say, that is the dumbest SHIT I ever heard. Why don't you just shut up and sit there? And now they're crushed, okay? You can't have an ego and be in the law in terms of that kind of correction. But the point being that there have been great minds, and I just want to say a word about Justice Marshall quickly, that Justice Marshall gets a lot of recognition for Brown versus the Board of Education. But what's missing is that Thurgood Marshall was Solicitor General of the United States, that he argued some 50 cases, antitrust, tax, all kinds of cases before the Supreme Court. And as far as I recall, he never lost a case. So the man was brilliant beyond just civil rights in terms of what took place. And so he should be there. I think one of the greatest insults to America and to us as African-American people was the placing of Clarence Thomas in that seat after him. But that's another story. Okay. And so I think that Kavanaugh is more than qualified, but here's the problem with him in terms of the questions that you've heard. And I'll give you an example. Many of you have heard of the Dred Scott decision. And in 1857, there was a black man, I don't know if he was African American, there was a black man who was a slave, and he was owned by a person who moved around between free and slave states. And the gist of it was that he had a daughter that was born, and his daughter was born in a free territory, and so he ended up with the help of some abolitionists fighting for citizenship. And the court came down with a decision in the Dred Scott case in 1857, which said, in effect, that it was always paraphrased this way, that a black man had no rights that the government was bound to respect, and that black people didn't have any rights, and they weren't American citizens, and they just didn't apply. Now, this is very interesting, because when the Constitution was being drafted, the Constitution excluded Native Americans, and then when it got to us, we were 2/3 of a person. I haven't figured that out yet, how we can be 2/3 of a person. But maybe somebody had an idea. We were a fraction in terms of their minds. And so after he lost this, it was so embarrassing. His decision led, in effect, to the 13th Amendment. And if you really want to follow a good piece, there's a documentary on Netflix called The 13th by a black director, Ava DuVernay, and I know her family, that talks about how in the 13th Amendment, slavery is abolished. But if you read the small print, it says, with the exception, in effect, of people who are convicted of a crime. And so if you have been convicted of a crime, you technically lose your civil rights, and therefore you can be treated in a slave fashion. So hence we come with the 14th Amendment, and the 14th Amendment has a due process provision, and due process appears in the Constitution in two places. It appears in the 14th, where it identifies people, naturalized and artificial. And when I say artificial, that's where corporations are first identified as persons. Now, that gets to be very important, because we just had a decision on campaign finance by the Supreme Court, and that campaign finance decision lifted the barrier, the limit on how much corporations could put into campaigns, and really opened the floodgates for wealthy corporate people to buy government to the exclusion of the rest of the folks who didn't have money. So that was a very important due process provision in the 14th Amendment, and then the 15th Amendment guaranteeing the vote, which was important. And so 1857, the Scott decision is argued against Dred Scott. 1866, Congress passes its first Civil Rights Act. 1868, we move into these amendments that have been added. When we talk about amendments, the first 10 being the Bill of Rights, we have 27 amendments to the Constitution, 7 articles to the Constitution. Today, we are beginning to be more concerned about the 25th Amendment, which talks about the president being incapacitated, and how do we go about replacing the president if he's incapacitated. If you have followed, and let me know if you want to jump in. I'm just trying to get a lot. Okay. Day before yesterday, there was an op-ed piece in the New York Times, and that op-ed piece was written, as you gather from the news, by someone within the inner circle of the White House. And it has begun to raise questions about the president's competency in terms of how he's functioning and whether or not he should be replaced. Now, there's a gentleman by the name of Alan Lipkin, and he has written a book that came out earlier this year called The Case for Impeachment. And I would recommend it as reading if you're really interested in following this issue. The impeachment issue is important because it's been used 2 times historically. The first time it was used against Andrew Johnson, who was vice president with Abraham Lincoln. And I don't know if any people ever did any research in terms of Johnson, but Johnson had a very interesting background. First of all, at 10 years old, he was hired out to a tailor as an apprentice. And he should have spent, they said, the rest of his life just sewing buttons or clothes. But the people that he worked for and his wife taught him how to read and write. And so I guess with that came the idea that really ought to be in politics. Okay? And so what happened after that was the Civil War came along. And since he was in Tennessee, I believe it was, there was an issue of free states, and I think Tennessee was one of the last of the states to join, of the 11 states to join the Confederacy. And so Johnson had gotten elected to the Senate, and he had not sworn allegiance to the Confederacy, as others from the South had. And so Tennessee was one of the first states that the Union recaptured. And in recapturing it, Abraham Lincoln appointed him as governor, kind of as a payoff. And so the next time when Lincoln ran, Johnson ended up running for vice president. And of course, when Lincoln was killed, Johnson then became president. But Johnson was an enemy to the reunification. And what happened was that Lincoln used the slave element as a means of bringing things back together. The South was very concerned about being brought back into the Union. And so Johnson made a deal with the South that really led to the creation of the Ku Klux Klan. It led to the rise of federalism. It led to states' rights and all of the kind of arguments that we heard under Nixon and Reagan in terms of things being turned upside down. We got to remember that Lincoln was a Republican, and black people, out of loyalty to Lincoln, voted Republican right up to Roosevelt. When we got the chicken in every pot and decided with the Works program that we could change over. So Johnson was very much like Trump in many respects. He was very strong-willed. He was going to do it his way. People got upset. The politics stirred up. He ended up having sufficient articles to be impeached, but he didn't get impeached. He came within 1 vote of being impeached. And so once that happened, he settled down and quietly served the rest of his term. The impeachment element is very important because under the Constitution, impeachment must originate in the House of Representatives. And once impeachment articles are created within the House of Representatives, the trial takes place in the Senate, and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court becomes a presiding judge. And so we know that when Bill Clinton was impeached, and I have copies of the articles, if you go back and look at the 3 articles that were used to impeach Clinton and the whole idea about lying under oath and Paula Jones and what happened with Monica, if you take just the articles that were done with him and then you look at the deck that's being stacked with Trump, there's more than sufficient information to come up with a series of articles at this point. But the reason it's not happening is because the Republican Party controls both the House and the Senate, and the Republicans are not going to impeach Trump. And so as long as he can maintain control of the House, which he's now losing, as we see these new people come up, like the young lady in Massachusetts and the Latino in New York, and now we have 3 states that have African Americans running for governor: Maryland, Georgia, and Florida. And so we have a groundswell of people rising up, getting involved in the process. They only needed 26 seats to turn the House over and flip it. There's a possibility they might come close to flipping the Senate, depending on what happens. And so once the House, after the midterm takes place, the articles, we can expect people to move. But it's a question of, will it last that long? Because of all of the things that are going on now with this op-ed and with this emerging discussion about the 25th Amendment. Quickly, what happens under the 25th Amendment is that the cabinet has to sign a letter saying that they see the president as unfit. And that's significant because the president has appointed the cabinet. So the people that he has appointed have to decide that he is no longer fit to be president. And once they sign that letter, along with the vice president, they have 48 hours to get that to the Congress, and something has to take place. And so we don't see that. We don't think it's going to happen, but at the same time, there's a groundswell of people who have been in prior administrations, who have come through this whole scenario, who are concerned because there's no longer a personality about Trump. It's no longer a question of where he stands on women. As one journalist said yesterday, this man can determine the fate of the human race because he has his hand on a button. Okay, and if he pushes the button, it's over. There's no need running for a shelter or whatever. You don't have that much time. You got about 20 minutes. Okay, that's just time enough to say goodbye and send a couple of texts, and then just go ahead and sit down and wait for the flash, because it'll be over. So it's getting to be a very, very serious issue that's taking place. The final comment I want to make in the opening is that, yes, Kavanaugh, I don't think there's ever been a Supreme Court justice who has produced some 400,000 pages of information, over 300 decisions that he has done and that he's written and gone through, and another 100,000 is being withheld under presidential privilege, which is getting to be a real issue because of how do you withhold these things. And one of the ways that things are withheld is because he has served in prior administrations. There were conversations that took place in terms of, say, presidential advice, like a lawyer speaking to his client, a lawyer-client privilege. And so a lot of the things that have been said are sensitive and they are under seal. And so the tragedy of our system today is that between the Democrats and the Republicans, there is no real push for truth. There is always a push for the other side's point of view. And so there was a time in this country, and especially when you go back to Supreme Court cases, you can see there was a time when there was a reasoning that took place to try to arrive at a decision in terms of how things were done. Let me give you an example of how this reasoning fell. We all know about the McCarthy era and how everybody was a communist and the whole bit, everything went on. And there was a case, as I remember the case, and I could be wrong if you go back and check it. I don't have Kavanaugh's recall, but there was a case of a Japanese American, I thought it was Kawamatsu for some reason, who was convicted of being, he was convicted of treason, and he was given the death penalty. And the Supreme Court upheld the death penalty. He was executed, and after his execution, they wrote the opinion to support the execution. Okay, that's kind of not the way it's supposed to work. Okay, the opinion should be written in advance and then followed up and reason to it. So when we have this discussion about stare decisis and settled law, the reason they keep questioning Kavanaugh, last example, then we open it up. In 1898, there was a case many of us are familiar with called Plessy versus Ferguson. And it was a test case where a man who had some African blood got on a train. It was predetermined. They said he couldn't ride in the white part of the train. They contested it. As a sidebar, if you go out to Campo, the Railroad Museum out there has reconstructed the segregated train car that they use for blacks. And if you go out there, and sometimes they have rides on that car, the interesting thing about that car is everything seems natural until you try to change cars. And when you try to go through the door to the next car, there are iron bars, just like a prison. So that, no, you cannot travel in that car. Now, second sidebar, during World War II, when there were some German prisoners here, there were some African-American troops that were assigned to transport German prisoners by train. America was so racist that the German prisoners were considered white, so they could ride in a white car, and the guards were considered black, so they had to ride in a black car, separate from the prisoners they were supposed to be escorting. Okay? And so here's the thing with Plessy. In the Plessy versus Ferguson case, we had the establishment of what was then called separate but equal doctrine, and we were supposed to have equal schools and all that kind of foolishness that never happened. The dissent in Plessy disagreed with that, and the dissent in Plessy in 1896 became the controlling decision in the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education. And so what that showed was that as the mood of the country changes, it's possible for the law to go back and to revisit things that have already been put on the books. And so that's the fear now in terms of Kavanaugh being a swing vote, that there's such a conservative swing that we could end up having due process overturned. We've already seen the gutting of the Voting Rights Act when they took Section 2 out, which provided for the federal monitors to go in. And now we see the threat to that when we look in Georgia, in Randolph County, Georgia, where this black woman is running for governor of the state of Georgia. They have already started a voter suppression effort by going into a black community and trying to close a polling place, which will cause the African Americans there to go as far as 10 miles just to vote. In the past, we saw this happen in Broward County, Florida, which has like a 96% black voter turnout. And I remember I used to be assistant to the Register of Voters for the District of Columbia. I helped design the precincts when DC got home rule. And I used to do elections, and so I dealt with hanging chads and do you count it by hand long before the voting machines came. And it was kind of interesting with the Gore-Bush situation, talking about chads in terms of it. But what happened in Broward County is that to slow down the black vote at one point, they decided to have sobriety checkpoints on Election Day. And the sobriety checkpoints were set up on all the main roads leading to the polling places where the blacks were going to vote. So that was to frustrate people getting there. Now, they went a step further. Somebody went into the records at the Register of Voters, and they went through the cards, and every card that had where you would identify your ethnicity, they whited out black and they checked off white. So when I show up to vote and they pull my card, they look at John Warren and they say, "You're not John Warren because the card says you're white." So you can't vote. And so what happens then is you have to vote what they call a provisional or challenge ballot. And so there's a great outcry taking place in Georgia, but I want to remind you that after Obama's elections, there were 18 states that came up with voter ID, or what we call voter suppression. And one of the stories that Senator Booker gave in questioning Kavanaugh was a case of an African-American man who was 92 years old, who had served in World War II and been through all kinds of stuff, and he wanted to vote, and he didn't have a voter ID, and at 92 it was kind of hard to go back to get his birth certificate, and so they put him through all of these changes looking for it, and finally the governor intervened and let him vote. That is also reminiscent of what happened with the poll tax before poll taxes were outlawed, that you had to pay a tax in terms of each person that could vote. Before the Voting Rights Act was passed, one of the things they did, I give you this interesting little scenario. In the South, a black person shows up to vote. And so they say, you got to recite the Constitution verbatim. So they recite the Constitution. Then they say, now you need to do it in French. And they ask the person, do you speak French? And they say no. But you know, like, how many jelly beans are in this jar? And can you count? And so all of these things were created to suppress and to stop. That's why that section, which was overruled recently by the Supreme Court, pulling the federal observers out in terms of the Justice Department, reducing the people who were there, opened the door for all kinds of issues. Today we have a new issue coming up with the age of algorithms and the computers. The gerrymandering has now gone to a scientific approach where they feed into the computer the demographics of the people who live in an area. They determine the likelihood of how to draw the boundaries in terms of getting the maximum vote return. And the result in that led to the Republican control of the House, because the way the things have been drawn, that no matter how you cut it or how many people you register, they have already identified who the rock solid voters are going to be, and that those people are going to turn out to make the difference in terms of what happens. So we're living in a very interesting time where most of us as ordinary people, without what I just kind of touched on, because there are whole courses on each of the areas that I mentioned, we're not going to take time for all of that. And we're going to be doing emotional voting. And unfortunately, we're now voting for people based on what color tie, how does he smile, is she cute, do I like the way they sound, they seem friendly, they hug my baby, and so anybody who hugs my baby, because I know how ugly my baby is, they must be my friend. Okay. All right. I'll stop at that point. I'm sorry.
I'm so happy that we have with us tonight Mayor Raquel Vasquez of the city of Lemon Grove. She's right over here. And I'm delighted to have with us the president of the Mountain Empire Historical Society and Mrs. President. And these are just that you referred to.
Okay.
Yeah, right. Wonderful. Who came all the way from Campo. So you know well the Buffalo Soldiers and the whole restoration. I've been keenly interested and have been following that because I'm on the County Historic Site Board. So we have had a great deal to say about that. And we're so happy to have Dr. Warren. There is a Mrs. Warren, and she's here. There she is. And Mrs. Warren's maiden name is Van Rensselaer, which I just learned, and she has a whole book on this. Hang on, people. Bridge Street to Freedom. This is I won't go on and on about this because I come from New York and am very familiar with the history of New York State and Rensselaer County and the Van Rensselaers who owned absolutely everything and the tenant farmers and all the rest of it, the whole story. And the Bridge Street to Freedom could be extrapolated actually to the story of upstate New York. So are we good? We're all fine?
Okay, 1, 2, 3.
We're back in business.
All right.
Okay, great. Back to Judge Kavanaugh, who is an exceedingly interesting candidate. I agree with you.
Yes.
And he did say that Plessy versus Ferguson, and before that the Dred Scott case, were, quote, stains on America.
Right.
And when Plessy was overturned, it was overturned. I should also say, this historical society feels very strongly about Justice Thurgood Marshall. He was all over the cases that came up that shut Mexican kids out of school in the 30s. And he was on the Westminster case in 1946. And he knew about the case in Little Lemon Grove, 165 kids, 75 of whom, give or take, were Mexican American and were shut out of the school. This case came and went in 2 months flat. And there was no appeal. It's not like the Deep South where the deck is so stacked against you, there's no way out. And he cited Lemon Grove, he and Thurgood Marshall et al. In 1954 in Topeka.
Okay.
And then, of course, as we all know, he won on the high moral ground. We did not. We won on a technicality, which is you couldn't lump Mexican kids together with Indians, Chinese, African Americans. So that's what happened there.
A very rich history for California.
So, can you talk a little bit about Brown, which Judge Kavanaugh said is the greatest court case in the history of American jurisprudence?
Well, you know, I can mention Brown, but one of my concerns, if you look at our headline today, and this is today's paper that you have, we see based on a recent study by the American Civil Liberties Union and the UCLA Civil Rights Project that America has changed drastically so that now the public school system is predominantly made up of children of color. What we had following Brown was a whole series of cases in terms of how do we integrate schools. And so we had busing, school busing cases. It was the busing issue that helped sink Robert Bork's nomination to the Supreme Court when they tried to push him through. And so Brown was very interesting in many respects. One of them was that for the first time, Thurgood Marshall and a black psychologist out of New York named Kenneth Clark, they went to the Deep South and they did a doll baby test where they took 2 dolls, one black and one white, and they presented the dolls to the kids, and the black kids invariably went for the white dolls. And so they were showing how this whole separate, unequal situation, the kids in the black schools were getting books that were torn, pages missing, all messed up. They were handed down. We already had the separate water fountains and all of the things, the cost with discrimination. And so Brown really undid the segregated scenario that had been created following Plessy. You see, well, let me just stick with Brown for a minute, because there were cases like the Spotswood v. Robinson and Charlotte v. Mecklenburg coming out of the Carolinas, where the busing issue was so real. And a lot of people were concerned, as we know in California, here in San Diego, we had a busing issue too in terms of our kids. And what people didn't understand was that the reason we were trying to put black kids into white schools in terms of desegregation is because we realized that if the salt and pepper was in the same shaker, you couldn't throw the pepper out without throwing out the salt. What made a difference was when the Civil Rights Act was being going through Congress, Adam Clayton Powell was chairman of Education and Labor, and he got Title VI of the Civil Rights Act put into the bill. And Title VI said that if you receive federal funds, then everybody has to be treated the same. And what they started doing then was they would put black kids and white kids in the same school, but they would put the white kids on the first floor and the black kids on the second floor. Okay, and so he aggressively, with the help of the Johnson administration, they went after these people. It extended to parks and recs, where the recreation system were like country clubs with federal monies, but black kids couldn't go in the swimming pool. And in Washington, D.C., if you ever seen pictures of Union Station, there's a big fountain out front. When I was growing up and the city had segregated pools, black kids used to go down to Union Station and they would swim in that fountain in front of everybody. And it was an embarrassment, but they couldn't just come and arrest them, right? And so they had these little spots out there in the pool and in the fountain in the summertime. And so finally they decided we better go ahead and integrate the pools and let it happen. Okay, but what happened was we have turned a curve because the battle against all deliberate speed has been persistent. And so we saw the onslaught of charter schools, and it was a question of how a charter school is going to be set up. Can we have federal funds go to charter schools? Well, that was argued 50 years ago when we created elementary and secondary ed, and we had parochial schools, and it was understood that the monies that people paid in taxes had a right to follow the child wherever the child went. And so, yes, we got schools integrated, but what happened following 54, we had white flight. So whites moved out, and in D.C., where I lived at the time, I was in a community where I went to school, and whites were fleeing from the school district. And many years later, when I was a member of the Board of Education, and Capitol Hill was my district, the same schools that people fled were under my jurisdiction, and I had the joy of going in there and renaming as many as I could. I just gave them all African names and changed the whole thing. Just changed it all around, okay? So we reach a point today where it's children of color, and everybody can't get into a charter school, and then the question comes up with if funds travel with the student and the student gets expelled, then where does the student go? Because by law, we have a statutory obligation to still educate. And so while Brown was important and it opened a door, we have bigger issues now because it's no longer race, it's now class, it's now economics in terms of where people live and where they want their kids to go to school. And there are as many affluent black people as whites who don't want their kids going. Nobody wants their child in an inferior school, okay? And Horace Mann, when he was Secretary of Education in Massachusetts, I remember he gave a speech and he made the observation that straight out of the Bible, that where your money is, there your heart will be also. And so that idea was then that if we're putting dollars into schools, then parents are going to get involved. So we have more parents involved with charter schools and private schools because they're paying and they're involved with the schools. And we have a diminishing number of students now, where we have fewer students. We still have to educate them. The system is top heavy. And so Brown becomes important only in the sense that we don't want to see Brown become the victim of what happened with Plessy. And when we get a conservative majority court, will they change? Will the pendulum swing so far to the right that the system changes? Because Betsy DeVos is already cutting funds to education. And they're already talking about abolishing the Department of Education. And 50 years ago, the Department of Education was not a separate department, but it was the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. And so they broke it up, and now we have a Department of Health and Human Services, we have a Department of Education, and we have all of these things going on. Now Trump wants to create a Department of Space Patrol, or whatever it is. Okay, so.
Dr. Warren, no, that's good. Can you talk personally a little bit about you? You're in North Carolina. Somewhere down the road, there's the transition to D.C. We should mention that Dr. Warren served for 9 years on the Washington, D.C. School Board. And I didn't know until you mentioned this, there's a national school board. Dang, I didn't know that. And you were on it for 4 years.
Yeah, the National School Boards Association is made up of 90,000 members from every school board in the nation. Reverend George Walker Smith here was the first African-American president of the National School Boards Association. And I was slated to become the second. I was elected to that board of directors, and during my time, we built the building that's now in Alexandria. But I left the education movement to go to law school at the age of 35, I think it was. So, and so I got away from it.
When you were in North Carolina, your
I didn't
parents
spend-
sent you where to go to school?
My parents were moved to D.C., and so I went to school in Washington, D.C., through that whole system, all the way through high school. The interesting thing was that my mother had grown up in the segregated school system of North Carolina, didn't want me to go there. During the time that I was a member of the National Board of Directors, the State of North Carolina School Board Association invited me to come to their annual meeting as their keynote speaker. And it was in 1980. My mother died in September of 1980, and I went to North Carolina she died in October 1980, and I went a month later in November of 1980. And I always thought it would have been great for her to have lived to see me come back to that state to play that kind of role in state education when she wouldn't allow me to go to school in the state because of how segregated it was.
Where did you get your love of horses from? Where does that come from?
That's a very interesting question because, see, I always felt that I was supposed to live in the West, okay? So I was a wagon train fiend, and I used to watch the Mouseketeers, and I was always bothered that the white kids on the Mouseketeers, that they spent summer at camp, and they were on ranches, and they had horses, and there weren't no horses where I grew up. It just didn't happen. And so I've always been a cowboy at heart. So when I came out here, my wife and I, we got interested, we started buying horses. I had 6 horses. I had 3 quarters, 3 Arabians, and the family rode every year in the Martin Luther King Parade before we got the national holiday. And so it was a perfect place to be. I wear my 6 guns and ropes and all that kind of stuff. So I'm just a little century, a little late, okay? So I just love horses. I don't ride anymore, but I still love horses, okay? But I would be interested if they're, based on the people here who are watching, if there were any questions from them in terms of what took place.
People sing out constitutional questions, historical questions. What did you know and when did you know it? Over here.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, Dr. Warren, I want to thank our gracious hostess for having this. This is so important, especially because history is, the great Malcolm X said, of all the things we can study, history is best prepared to reward our research because in it we find nuggets of how we can advance ourselves in the future. I wanted to ask you, Dr. Warren, because I know you as an activist, and now I'm knowing you even better as a legal person. How do you think the social movements of the time, any given time, whether it was Plessy, whether it was Boyd versus Topeka, or whether it's the police, how do you think those social movements influence jurisprudence on the state level, local level, as well as on the federal level? And what can we do if we don't like what's jumping off?
Well, I think that's a critical question that you raised, because the one thing that keeps the Constitution alive as a fluid document is that it does pay attention. I remember during the whole discussion about Nixon and Barbara Jordan, who was a brilliant jurist from the state of Texas, and she was a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And there were questions coming up in terms of executive powers and all of the arguments over the Congress, where the president stood with the Congress. And she made this statement, which I can still hear her voice as she said it. She said, the Constitution is alive and vibrant and real. And the life of the Constitution has a lot to do with the wind checks that are made on the social changes that take place. Case in point, under the Fourth Amendment, we have search and seizure. And so search and seizure guarantees that they can't come into your home. The Constitution is specific without probable cause, without identifying the specific area to be searched and what's being looked for. And yet we know that when we have the issues of driving while black and the police stop you, the first question they ask a black man is, are you on parole or probation? Because if you're on parole or probation, then you have waived your right to the Fourth Amendment protection against search and seizure. Under Map v. Ohio, it has already been established that your car is an extension of your home, so cops just can't stop you and just search your car for the heck of it. They ask people, can I search? And those who don't know say yes when they should say no. And so they get into all kinds of things. But it's the compilation of social things that take place that move the pendulum. And so what we had, for instance, is when California moved toward 3 strikes and crime was up, and the courts made the decision, and it was legislatively done, that, okay, we're going to enact a law that says if you get 3 felony strikes, 25 to life. And so then the court needed to uphold that. But here's the problem. I believe it's the 8th Amendment that speaks against ex post facto lawmaking. And what it says in effect is that if I did something today, you can't pass a law tomorrow that jails me for what I did yesterday. And so what happened with this ex post facto is that when we got the 3 strikes, because of all the crime, and when the crime started hitting white communities, then people started getting concerned about who was committing crime. And so the law enforcement lobbyists in Sacramento pushed for more people to be locked up. At the same time they were pushing to lock up more people, there was more money being spent to build more prisons. And so prisons became privatized. And so now they're being traded on the stock exchange. And so the movement is that we can't have empty beds. And so if we're going to have people, we got to find ways to lock folks up. And so now the social attitude, the reaction to what's perceived as more whites being attacked has led to a law change, and the court's making a decision that upholds that. And the Supreme Court is sitting at the top looking at what's going on and trying to gauge what's going to be our response to this. How are we going to come at this issue? And so there are people who are going to be liberal because they want to protect rights. And then there are those, the Kavanaughs are called the strict constructionists, who take the position that this is what the Constitution says and we're going to hit the full penalty of law, when there's supposed to be some discretion, okay? And so the closest thing that we have to that right now is that last week, Governor Brown signed SB 10, which abolishes cash bail. And so people are excited about the abolition of cash bail, and the cash bail moves to a risk assessment system, where now the judge has the power to determine whether or not you should go free. And that carries with it its own set of problems, depending on who the judge is and what the issue is, okay? And so the court's gonna end up looking at that, because the people who are making $14, $15 million a year in the bail business, their entity is gonna go to court and challenge what the governor signed, because the state system is a mirror of the national system. And that's going to lead to the state Supreme Court having to make a decision as to whether the abolishment of cash bail stands. And if they lose at the state level, they're going to take it to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court is going to be looking at what have other places done. One of the first places they look at is the District of Columbia, because the District of Columbia abolished cash bail some 20, 30 years ago, is doing a risk assessment approach, has got all kinds of statistics showing 98% of people showing up, and they don't have to do bench warrants. The bail industry is saying, our people show up because we go get them. And so that becomes a part of the social dynamic that people are watching. The Black Lives Movement, the whole thing about how the police are treating people, all of this plays in. And if you have people on the court who have that total right leaning in the first place, then you have problems. The one thing that saved California is that the federal court came in, decided that our prison situation was so bad that it ordered the elimination of the overcrowding in the prisons and health care and all those things. And so the stock market is gyrating now, because people are own stock in the Correction Association of America, own the prisons and everything. They're going to be losing money because they have some empty beds. The downside is that we get people coming back to the county now to be housed instead of the state. So then when the governor signed SB 47 and what was the other one, 50 something, which reduced crimes from felonies to misdemeanors so that people could be held. A misdemeanor is anything that you can serve less than a year and a day for as a misdemeanor. And so that overcrowds the county prison system. So everything that's happening is connected. It's just a question of how much attention you pay to it. I'm sorry to be long-winded with it.
Questions? Back there. Yeah.
Dr. Warren, in your opinion as a legal scholar,
Big boys. Big boys.
I'll stand up. In your opinion as a legal scholar, a journalist, and as a father, how would you recommend the Constitution is taught to the younger generation of Americans so as to communicate its vibrance and vitality?
It's a good question. Let me tell you what I have observed. People coming to this country seeking citizenship. If sometimes you'd go to Univision, watch Hispanic television, you'll see ads on for citizenship kits. And the citizenship kits explain the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. By the time people coming here hold their hand up, they know more about how this government works than the people born here. Because we haven't paid any attention to it. Because our education system has deliberately obscured the finer workings of government, because if you understand more, you demand more. If you understand more, you become a participant, you become a voter, you get involved. We don't want that. We want you to just do what you're told, follow it, because education is supposed to help keep you in your socialized place. We can't have a whole nation of people thinking and making demands and stuff. I mean, where's the world going to be? You know, we're going to upset the apple cart that Adam Smith saw in Wealth of Nations. So you gotta help you gotta raise your kids with a sense of social consciousness. Okay, so I grew up in the age of Carter G. Woodson still being alive, Du Bois alive. I had conversations like we're sitting here now. I used to have this kind of conversation with Malcolm X because I had an opportunity to meet him through Powell. As a journalist, I've been blessed. I've had this kind of conversation with Bishop Tutu in terms of his humanitarian concerns. And so Rosa Parks, we had many deep conversations in terms of what did it mean being AME, what place, that's one of the first questions I asked her, what part did being a member of the A&E Church under Allen play in your not giving up your seat? And she just smiled as she went into the discussion of it. We have to raise our kids with a sense of history. And unfortunately today, most young people, they're not interested in what happened yesterday, let alone last year.
Dr. Warren,
Dr. Warren, could you say what AME is? I think that's...
Oh, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Okay. And the African Methodist Episcopal Church was established when the Methodists decided that they didn't want blacks to worship with them. And so Richard Allen, out of Pennsylvania, they decided that we will create our own church. And it is one of the oldest churches in America today. In New York, where you're from, they didn't want blacks to worship with them. And so the people went out and founded Abyssinian. Yes. Which Adam Clayton Powell's father pastored and he pastored. Yes. And what the people who founded Abyssinian told the white congregationists when they said, y'all can't worship with us, they said, we were an organized society when you were still living in caves. And so we don't need to worship with you. Okay, and so one of the significant things about Abyssinian is the gold lectern on the podium in Abyssinian is a gift from Haile Selassie because he used to go there. And Fidel Castro, the rebel that he was, whenever he was in New York, he always went to Abyssinian. He always hung out in Harlem because he had an affinity for the church and for the people there. And so these kind of things these are real people. And today you just get this kind of sanitized version of folks, but you don't know who you sit next to that's going to be history, you know, in terms of, one day somebody will probably say they knew me and they'll say, oh yeah, right.
Yes. I was going to say, what are your thoughts about the Voting Rights Act when you said the Voting Rights Act, but here it was the Board of Supervisors said that our voter rolls are are at 137%. So there's 37% of people who should not be voting that are voted within our county here.
Well, that's going to happen because I think one of the states that California made is that it started in the direction of motor voter, and when you get your driver's license, you get a voter registration, and there's no citizenship check or anything like that. And so there's a danger in terms of who ends up being able to vote that shouldn't be voting. And we have this horrible case in Texas of this black woman, and she was just in the paper. She served some time in prison. She came out of jail. She decided to vote. She cast a provisional ballot, and she voted. Last week, she was sentenced to 6 months in jail. She was accused of voter fraud, even though they said that, well, people who are convicts can't vote. You knew that, and you shouldn't have registered. But she didn't try to conceal anything. When you do a provisional ballot, that allows them to check your name, to check whatever it is, to raise any questions, and then decide whether or not they count the ballot. It's not an automatic count. So we probably have a lot of people that shouldn't be, but at the same time, we don't have great voter turnout. And also in California right now, the number of people who are registered as independents is greater than the number of Republicans registered in the state. So we in effect have an unofficial third party. We have Democrat, Republican, and Independent. And so the most important thing we can do is make sure that we vote. Okay?
People, is everyone in this room registered to vote?
Yes.
Show of hands.
If there's anybody who isn't, they're not going to say so, right?
That was mean.
Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Warren, as a reverend and as a lawyer, on Wednesday nights when the churches have their Bible study, might we put in some constitutional information? That would be a nice segue. Would that be?
I'm laughing because you're going into some interesting territory. I am an ordained minister. I was raised a Baptist. I'm evangelical. I was first ordained in Chicago, and not because I wanted to be in ministry. I was drafted because I thought that was the last place I ever wanted to be. But my second ordination was in the state of Texas with Bishop Hilliard. And so in our place, I have tried over the years to pull our pastors together. I have sponsored breakfasts, and I brought them together to try and get them to understand that there is a social element to the gospel, because Jesus didn't run from the gospel. Jesus said, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar, and unto the Lord that which is his. And so we were called to be active. And the church was active during the Civil Rights Movement. But today, when you talk about Wednesday nights, they're not going to give it up. First of all, most of the things that they call Bible study are not Bible study. Okay? See, in our church, when you come to church, you need to bring your Bible and a pad when you come to church. Because when I teach, I'm going to teach scripture. I'm going to give you facts and history. I'm going to tell you how the Bible was written, who wrote it, why, how every book got in there, why books aren't in there, what the Apocrypha is, why it's not there. So I get a lot of people who are Catholic who grew up with a liturgy that did not give them any historical perspective. And it gets to be very important because, especially today, we have this attitude where many African Americans who ended up becoming Islamic and other faiths turned away from Christianity because they read those provisions in the epistles where Paul said, you know, be obedient to your master and do all of that. But that wasn't the context in which he was saying it, but the church has functioned that way. And the church is still the most segregated place in America, as we say every Sunday, in terms of people. And so it's very hard to, I do a lot of one-on-one with pastors, and each year when we have our annual gala, I give a Good Shepherd Award. I pick pastors who are moving in the direction of social interaction. I give them a great big statute that they can take home and sit wherever they want to. And the first year I did it, a lot of them ran out to the store and tried to order it, but I had already had it copyrighted and trademarked. So you can't get it unless I give it to you. Okay. So that's the problem. We still, and the parishioners have to ask for that. They need to ask for more involvement.
Evelyn, how influential is the Voice and Viewpoint in San Diego County?
How influential? Well, the Voice and Viewpoint has been here for 59 years in all of the cities, 87 zip codes, in all of the areas of the county. The position of the paper, I think, has been one of advocacy. I think that's evidenced by the fact that many of the editorials that I've written over the years have led to the county civil grand jury doing studies, and many of their studies have come back to confirm things that I already said in the beginning. We cover the news from an African American perspective because there's no such thing as black news. There's news that affects black people. We also show on our logo, it says San Diego's African and African American communities because we're involved with our African communities. And so I think the paper has been very influential. As a matter of fact, in the earlier years, when I first came here, I came to California with the desire to practice law, get rich, and sit on the beach. None of that happened. I ended up clerking for the county and for the city before buying the paper, and then becoming adjunct professor at National University. And I did a lot of social insurance lecturing at places like Harvard and Carnegie Mellon in the area of social insurance income security. And so my position was to take my 12 years on the Hill, to take the things I knew about government, and to look at how things were being done here, and to then move and push for inclusion and changes in policy. And I think we were successful. When I first came here and got the paper, I went to City Hall and asked for a key to the press room, and they told me they wouldn't give me one. And I told them, you either will give me one or you will close. Okay, and so I had to fight. I had to fight for it. I had to fight for press credentials to the Chargers, and I don't like football. Okay, and then once I got the credentials, I had to find somebody to go to the games because I didn't want to go. I don't care who wins, or I'm just not interested. So we have had an impact both at the county, at the state level, and in the municipalities in it. And I think the fact that we are doing what we do. We've never had a sales staff, not during my tenure. Our business is 99% unsolicited. Our clients are federal, state, local, international. The State Department frequently brings people from other countries who are in journalism to meet and talk with me about issues in America in terms of journalism. And so I think we've had an impact. Okay. I don't want to be too self-serving. By the way, please give Gary Northcote my regards. All right. Yes.
Slightly change in questions and so forth. I'm from Campo. We run the Stone Store Museum, the Historical Society there, and you mentioned the Railroad Museum and the segregated car that was there. Also, Camp Lockett was the home to about 5,000 Buffalo soldiers during the Second World War, and a lot of horses and so forth. And so we have worked with Diane Jacobs in the past, and with supposedly with Eldonna Lay, who was going to write a story, a book, about the area.
She's right behind you.
Oh, good. And so, how are you? And so I had gotten word that you might be interested in looking in.
Diane and I have talked about it within the past, I think it was in August. She and I had a long discussion. We got some plans. I met with Gary. Is it Gary? Rick Northcote. Rick Northcote. And then there's another gentleman. Les. I met with Les. I met with both of them. Right. Okay. And because the Buffalo Soldiers were out there when they were here, we were promoting their event. Right. And the Camp Lockett was the last home of the mounted units before they were sent off to the war. So Diane personally called me because I used to live in Hamul, and we have a long, Diane and I go back to when she was a school board member. Okay, so I've known Diane for over 30, 40 years. And so she talked to me about it, and I'm going to be getting with Rick and Les and getting with you and seeing what we can do.
We're the ones with the archives.
Okay, then we need to talk.
Thousands of facilities.
We'll
I
talk
just
after
wanted to
this.
invite you out and let you know that we're open to working with you and so forth. I will.
Yeah, so we'll exchange, and I will come out there. It's a little bit of a journey for me, but I'll get there.
We're coming right back. Eldonna Lay, who wrote Valley of Decision and rewrote it, and Valley of Opportunity, the story of El Cajon, former president of the El Cajon Historical Society, and the curator of the wonderful Knox House Museum in El Cajon.
And predecessor
Yes.
to the historic sites board.
Yes, and my predecessor on the historic site board, exactly. And yes, you have been earmarked to write the story of
Yes.
the aforementioned.
And then I backed out because I didn't think a white woman should be writing this very complex, so.
I'm sorry.
Okay, she's backed out. Okay.
Yeah, I did, yeah, because I didn't think it was right.
Then the ball is in
And I recommended you to Diane, which is why, and I've known her since we taught to school together.
Okay, great. We'll all get together.
Okay.
Okay.
Question right here.
I think we should volunteer Ms. Edwina here for the task, but,
I'm saving
yes,
that
okay.
for last.
But, so, thank you for hosting this, and for my colleague, Tambuzi's, kind of remarks. So, Dr. Wine, I wanted to, putting that, I'm probably not going to say the question as best as it should, but a couple of things that came up in the hearings the last few days regarding Judge Kavanaugh. And so precedents came up quite a bit, and settled law. And two of the cases that came up was the, I think the Plessy case, totally immoral decision, and something that came up during the Supreme Court decision with the travel ban, with the case of the Japanese gentleman who got locked up.
Yes.
And so, and I think, so Chief Justice Roberts said something about, to the effect that history has kind of like settled that. But do you think that the court should go back and review those cases, or just let it go like that, that they made a bad decision both in the two of the cases you cite with the Plessy and the Dred Scott? That's something that should go back and revisit?
Well, first you have to understand how the court makes the decision on which cases it hears. Okay, and when they call it, it's called granting certiorari, permission to be heard by the court. The court gets thousands of cases, and it picks through and it decides.
Yeah, and I understand that.
Yeah.
I'm talking about,
Well, I'm going somewhere answering your question. The problem is that they just don't go back to those cases unless they have a current case that challenges an element of those cases. Okay, then they can go back and revisit it. One of the cases you heard a lot about in the past couple of days was Griswold V Connecticut.
Yeah.
Okay, and some of you older members might know that when Griswold was argued, there was a question of whether or not a couple was using contraceptives in terms of when they had sex. And the government took the position that the state has no prevailing interest in what goes on in the privacy of one's bedroom. Okay? Now, what happened when we had the Lgbtq movement come along, we had a situation where members of the gay community staged a situation, I believe it was in Texas, where there was an apartment where two men were having sex. A third person called the local police. They left the door to the apartment open. The police came in and caught them in the act. And now this situation is going to go into the court system, the same way they set up Plessy to get it involved. And when they got into the court system, of course, they go back to Griswold and argue, does the government have any interest, regardless of whether it's men or women, does the government have any prevailing interest in what happens in the privacy of that? That gets to be the kind of standard for the cases you're talking about. We're going to see new situations come up, and they're going to be looking at how do we reach back. And the people who want to change, say, Brown, or they want to change a past court decision like they did Voting Rights Act, then they'll find a case that they can structure to bring a challenge against the settled law, stare decisis. And that's why we keep getting Kavanaugh bombarded with that, because they know that those kind of cases are out there. Will this conservative bench, if he's added, then look for those cases as vehicles to undo settled law? I hope I answered your question, because the case is going to make the decision.
So essentially, from a layman's point of view, there is no settled law, because some privilege that we enjoy now, 50 years from now, we may not have.
Possible.
He has been besieged, actually, with, is it settled, is it pending? And he has tried to walk a very narrow line right down the middle.
He's tried to suggest that what's settled is not going to be bothered, but he's got too many places where he's made comments that suggest that, no, it might be settled, but that don't mean you won't revisit it. And I say this about him, my concluding comment about Kavanaugh. Kavanaugh is an oxymoron. He is a prodigy with Down syndrome, okay? So he's a prodigy in terms of remembering every case, every line, every issue that was ever written. But when you ask him something about who he talked to yesterday, I don't remember. Okay, and it can't be both ways, and that's a flag to people, like when Senator Harris said, be very careful how you answer me, which suggests that they got some information. And there is a strong belief, see, it's not a question of is he qualified. We know the man is qualified, and that's where the problem comes. The problem also comes with the fact that when Obama nominated Gorsuch, he should have been given the same courtesy of the hearing that's being given to Kavanaugh. And yet McConnell just blatantly said, we're not going to do it. He was in violation not only of the Constitution, but he was in violation of Merrick Garland. But he was also in violation of his oath of office, because his oath of office says he's supposed to uphold the Constitution, and part of the procedures is a part of the Constitution. And so you ignore it because of Obama, but now you're going to try to speed run it on this end. And that takes it outside of the area of his qualification to it now being a political football in terms of who's going to kick the ball. And it's unfortunate, because I think we lose when we have that kind of thing. Just as a footnote, if you saw the documentary on Ruth Bader Ginsburg, you will note that the Ginsburg was confirmed by a vote of 92 to whatever it was. So that, I mean, there will never be that record of confirmation again, because every vote that comes in the Senate is going to be down party lines. It's not going to be a question of who's best qualified. It's going to be party lines, and that's the tragedy.
The irony is that Merrick Garland served on the D.C. Circuit with Kavanaugh.
Yes.
And they have high regard for each other.
Yes.
It's just a heartbreaker. It's awful.
It is.
Yes, back.
I wanted to ask, hearing about the impeachment process of Donald Trump, if he were to be put down, had to step off, what are your feelings regarding Mike Pence and how it would impact communities of color?
Be careful what you wish for.
As far as communities of color are concerned, Mike Pence is more dangerous than Donald Trump. But we're not going to talk about just gay rights. I'm talking about Pence and his track record in terms of when he served in Congress. But Mike Pence is smart enough to be presidential. And so, yes, he does all the right things. When we had the floods in Texas, he and his wife showed up appropriately dressed. They were in jeans. They were right there with the people, hands on. Trump shows up, and he and his wife are trying to sell their hats to people down there. So you know, Pence is gonna end up being president one way or the other. All he has to do is just stay polite and
You
just
don't
wait.
hear a lot from him. You don't hear a lot.
You're not going to, because as vice president, you shouldn't hear a lot from him.
Exactly.
He should be just where he is, quietly doing what he does and waiting his turn.
Dr. Warren,
She had a question all the way.
yes, somebody had a question?
No, standing. Sister Ham?
No, she was.
Oh, okay. I thought you did. Okay.
I have a comment.
Yes.
So my name is Vida Album, and I've known you for 2 years, and I want to say I am amazed at your wealth of information and honored to be in your company. So thank you for this.
Thank you.
Yes.
Too
Very
kind.
nice.
Too kind.
Dr. Warren, should we do a lightning round? I'll mention a few names. Who walked into a room and everybody got up and screamed? He went to the beach and wondered why he was there. What is that story?
Ralph Nader. Ralph Nader. You know, Ralph Nader was a workaholic. I don't know what he's still doing, but Ralph Nader was such a workaholic that his staff used to say, you need to take a break. You know, why don't you just go to the beach and just relax? So they kept on him, and so he went to the beach, he took off his shoes, he stood in the sand, he let his feet get in the water, and then he said, now what? What's next? Okay.
Why did they kill Malcolm X? What happened there? It's such a horrible story.
That's the question that I really can't. Let me say, I won't say I can't. That's a topic that I won't discuss because it's so involved. It's still sensitive. There are a lot of issues in it, and there are very strong feelings in the community. So I just won't discuss that. My brother back there has a comment. He's a member.
You know, Dr. Warren, you mentioned Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution.
Yes.
Is there a striking contrast to the statement that Malcolm made that as during the same time, that era, Malcolm was on the scene along with Dr. King and Fidel. Fidel had a revolution that overthrew the neo-colonial era. Jose Martin said that when he started the war against the colonials that colonized Cuba, he said you can take the chains off of the slave. If you don't erase the memory of being a slave from the slave, you still have a slave. And if you don't erase the memory of the master from being a master, you still have the master mentality. So is there a striking contrast that Malcolm was basically promulgating the Cuban Revolution as a real revolution that was bloodshed, which really proposed a threat to America because we had black power and this was post-civil rights. So is there a striking contrast that that was a danger and a threat to what we were doing, along with Dr. King? And in Cuba, there's a statue of King and both Malcolm, and their quotes are memorialized on the walls in the village or in the community. So is there something that may play out into that?
Let me just say, Brother Hamid just came back from Cuba, and he had a phenomenal experience in terms of being there. I remember when the Cuban Revolution took place, and it was very interesting because the Cuban Revolution didn't take place in isolation. The Cuban Revolution took place in relation to Che and the other elements in South America where the people were rising up. Most of us today have no idea of what Cuba was like before Castro. The one movie that probably gives you a glance of that is The Godfather, where Michael goes to Cuba and he's there on the eve of the revolution. And what happened was that American business had so taken over Cuba that the people were really living under difficulty. I think when we come to Malcolm, we got to look at a couple of things with Malcolm and with Martin. Malcolm was what the North needed. Martin was what the South needed. But Malcolm there are two sides to Malcolm X. There's the Malcolm X before he went to Mecca, and there's the Malcolm X after he went to Mecca. And the Malcolm X after he went to Mecca is the one that he was a gentle person. He was a quiet person one-on-one. I remember he used to come to the office early in the morning to meet with Powell, and because I opened the office, sometimes it'd just be the two of us there because he was always early, so it gave me an opportunity to talk with him. In those days, I had no idea. We didn't know who or what. I mean, it was just like you and I meeting early in the morning. We're sitting there and we're talking, and I'm discussing stuff that I've heard. I don't have any idea what I'm talking about, you know. And this man is just kindly listening to me as if I might know something. And it's only in recent years that I realized, when I look back, I said, boy, he was really nice. Because if he had just said, shut up, he probably would have destroyed me. Okay? But I think that you got to look at the time in which all three of them came on the scene. And there was an era of change that was working. And the change came in proportion to where the people were. So Malcolm would have never succeeded in the South, and Martin would have never succeeded in the North, because Martin had his own challenges in the North. Remember, he and his wife even went to Chicago and lived in public housing and did all of those things in terms of trying to bring it together. While Cuba, at the time that you're talking about with Cuba fighting, Castro was under constant siege by the CIA and the people here who were trying to kill him and never could get to him. He was the one that survived the whole thing. So we have to just kind of balance it. I hope at some point the story will really be told in terms of it, because I think Cuba is a special place right now because it's really untouched by modern capitalism in terms of all of the changes that have taken place. It's kind of like a bubble, and there's a purity to it and to the people, and especially people who look so much like us.
In your paper, you pointed out the Spike Lee's revisiting of the Black Ku Klux Klan. Okay. And the movie basically talks about and shows there has been very little change from that era of the David Duke Klansmen, and I think the movie comes out and plays out Donald Trump in his statements and saying there are bad people on one side, there's good people on the other side, etc. So we're in an era with Black Lives Matter, and we're talking about no change, we're still talking about justice. Are we liberated, or are we more assimilating the people that basically oppress us? Are we trying to assimilate in terms of freedom, being free?
Well, briefly, I haven't seen the Klan movie, and one of my concerns is whenever we talk about the Klan is promoting the Klan and giving them publicity. For every time the Klan is mentioned, I would like to see us mention the deacons.
That's right.
Okay? And the deacons were the black men who organized in the South against the Klan. And the deacons were armed. And the deacons went out and met, and they made a movie about them, and the movie was such a disservice, I wish they had made it. Because these guys were smart, they were armed, and wherever the Klan showed up, they met them with guns and with force. And the Klan quickly backed off of any place where the deacons were. And it's like a hush, hush, hush. The history doesn't want to mention these black men who organized and met them at gunpoint. And not only did they meet them at gunpoint, but some of these people had been like longshoremen, and they had been worked the docks, and they were able in the South to get weapons in, because the longshoreman union, that's another whole world, the way they organized. We had 3 union entities in America that became powers unto themselves. The railroad with its own separate entity, and the longshoremen, and then later we had the civil service system that just kind of filled in for everybody else. And so I always want to mention the deacons, because we don't want to give too much credit to the Klan in terms of what they did and how. And remember, Malcolm had an early experience with the Klan when he was a child, in terms of what happened to his home and attack on his home and burning it and everything. So let us not, the Southern Poverty Law Center needs to be watched just the same way we're watching the Klan today, because they are attacking organizations and entities that shouldn't be, and labeling folks as terrorists, and people are following them because they're in lockstep with, what's the Jewish group, that anti-defamation? ADL? No, but yeah, the Anti-Defamation League. Yeah, they all, that's another story, I'm sorry. Too many other stories. Running out of time.
And so I think when you talk about, and have you talked about, when you talk about Cuba and Castro, one of the factors you have to also include is the dynamics of the Cold War and Cuba having a lifeline to the USSR. Because without the USSR, after the failure of the Bay of Pigs, there could have been another attempt. So, you know,
well, let's give Cuba credit for having a lifeline to the USSR. You know, while we were bashing Cuba, as a young man, I was in Mexico, and I remember being in Mexico City and traveling in the country and looking at the high esteem to which Castro was held in the Latin countries, okay?
In the English-speaking Caribbean also.
Yes, and so it made sense to make friends with Russia, who could give the resources that they need that they no longer had from here, and Russia needed Cuba in terms of getting that close to us. And okay, so I don't blame him for what he did. Most of us don't realize today that Guantanamo is on the island of Cuba. Okay, and no, it's not like in a separate location, and it's just that the island is divided in terms of where they are and where the people live. Okay.
Question here.
This gentleman back here was trying to get his head.
Sorry.
I was trying to
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say gentleman. I couldn't see for the light.
No, I'm not a gentleman.
No.
But I have a question. How do you, as a writer, a lawyer, a publisher, and the list goes on with all your credentials, how do you reconcile the history that you lived with the history that's depicted about the time you lived? For example, I was very much there when the Black Panthers were formed in the Bay Area. There at the initial meetings, saw Huey and Bobby every day, Eldridge, whatever, that whole scene, pictures that are depicted. I was in the background when the pictures were taken. And I just observed, you know, when the history is being written and told these days, that a lot of the facts are distorted, that often people who are, you know, essential and there were left out. For example, Mariana Wadi, who played such a pivotal part in the Bay Area in terms of the Black Students Union and in terms of the Panthers using her home for their meetings. She's left out of the history. And when the movie that recently came out was being put together, I wrote to them and said, why are you not mentioning Mariana and some other people? They didn't respond.
Do you remember Nathan and Julia Hare?
Yes,
okay.
Most definitely. I used to talk to him.
Okay.
I remember when he was at San Francisco State.
This is a couple that were psychologists. They were very active in the movement.
He was my boss for a short time.
Which one?
Hare, because I was supposed to teach a course, a Black Studies course at San Francisco State. And he at the time was visiting.
The answer to your question is that I think, and my family is on me about this constantly. Like I got like 3 books in my head. They want me to hurry up and write. And my wife is helping me. I've compiled all of my commentaries for the past 20 years. And I got them in volumes of books. And she's such a prolific writer, going through stuff that she's helping me with it. What happens? I remember having dinner here with Nathan and Julia. They were friends of a friend of ours that's deceased now. And we often talked about those days in terms of what happened. And I think the same thing with Julian Bond. I had this conversation with Julian as well. Because what happens is we begin to be we've got this recall and we see the transitioning that's taking place. But I have found that there's a 25-year difference between when some of us die and when people actually start writing and looking at what we did or what we said. So we're always in a transition mode. And I think that this electronic age is going to retard that a great deal, because we're no longer going back looking and building on history. See, the beauty about the Panthers, and people just miss this, that the government did so many injustices, you know, killing Fred Hampton and all these guys and the stuff that they did, but these people were brilliant. They did their homework. When Angela Davis got up to speak, you know, here's a sister that had a PhD in philosophy. She knew what she was talking about. And this whole concept of feeding people, look at one of the ways they raise money in the Bay Area. And my stepdaughter here, she's a graduate of Berkeley. What the Panthers did was, in that whole revolutionary attitude in the Bay Area, they went and got Chairman Mao's Little Red Book. And they sold copies of his Little Red Book to all those white radicals that were on campus. And they raised money selling the book, so that then they were able to, they had a Ministry of Information, they had a breakfast program, they had feeding, so they had all of these things, that they knew the law. When the rest of us in the country saw the picture of all these people standing on the steps of the Capitol in Sacramento holding guns and we were intimidated, they had already researched the law and knew that they legally had a right to do so. So it's up to us who have some memory right now to start that recording, writing, putting it together. And I'm speaking to myself as well, so that there will be some who are interested. Some of you represent a transitional entity, and it will make a difference. But I'm worried about the generation that follows us. Last week, I think my wife and I went to see, what was it, the finale, the thing about Adolf Eichmann. Okay, and it was very interesting. We went in the middle of the day to see this, and everybody in the theater was the age of this room. Okay, well, why the younger generation? The younger generation don't understand what the numbers mean on your arm, and how important that is. Okay, and so, but if we don't stop and talk to the ones who at least will stop long enough to listen, it just won't happen. So I don't know. I didn't mean to give you so much, but thank you.
People, we're going to keep Dr. Warren and never let him go. I think we need part two. All agreement? Yes? Yes.
Thank you.
We have a little something, if there's any room on your office wall for this, Dr. Warren. This is a little memento, and here's a few more little mementos. And this includes a DVD of Gary McClintock, the great saddle maker.
Oh, yes, our friend. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Wonderful. Okay. Good. Thank you so much. Yeah.